homeless man sat outside the gym, his eyes reflecting both hope and despair, until Sylvester Stallone noticed him. What happened next will leave you speechless. It was a grueling, sweat-drenched day at a Planet Fitness gym. Bodybuilders came and went, pushing their limits before heading out. Just another routine day. But one man stood apart from the rest. His presence was undeniable. Muscular beyond his years, instantly recognizable even from afar. He was none other than Sylvester Stallone, the man who made bodybuilding a lifestyle. And on this day, he was pushing himself to the very last rep like it was his first. As soon as he finished his final set, Sylvester Stallone exhaled deeply, his muscles burning with exhaustion. He grabbed his towel, wiped the sweat off his face, and stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The streets were alive with movement. Cars speeding past, people chatting as they walked by, the usual buzz of the city. As he made his way toward the exit, something caught his eye. A man sat hunched on the pavement, just outside the gym's entrance. His frail frame was wrapped in layers of worn-out clothing, a faded teal hoodie pulled over his head, a tattered coat draped over his shoulders, and a pair of baggy, mustard-colored pants that had seen better days. His face, framed by a thick graying beard, bore the weight of years spent battling the elements and the hardships of life. At first glance, he was just another homeless person blending into the city's backdrop, someone most people would pass without a second thought. But there was something different about him, something that made Stallone slow his stride. The man's posture was weary, his clothes torn and covered in dust. Yet his eyes, those eyes held something more than just exhaustion. There was a quiet flicker, a faint glimmer buried beneath the weight of struggle. Hope? Resilience? It was hard to tell. Stallone lingered for a second longer than he should have. Then, without a word, he took another step forward. But somehow he knew this wasn't just a passing moment. As he tried to walk past, something pulled at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. The homeless man wasn't just another drifter on the street. There was something different about him, something that didn't quite fit. Despite looking weak and worn, there was a certain presence about him. His body, though frail, seemed like it had once been strong. His posture, though slouched, carried a trace of discipline. And then there were his eyes, sharp, alert, carrying a weight far beyond simple misfortune. Stallone knew what it felt like to be drained, but this man, he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Yet there was something about him that seemed too much for an ordinary person in his situation. Who is he? Stallone thought to himself. What's his story? Something told him this wasn't just another man down on his luck. There was more to this stranger than met the eye. Stallone studied the man before him, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The raw pain in his voice, the bitterness. It was all too familiar. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The streets of Santa Monica carried on as if this conversation didn't exist. People walked past without a glance, cars sped by, music echoed from a passing radio. To them, this was nothing more than a routine sight, another forgotten man blending into the pavement. The man sat hunched against the wall, his coat a patchwork of wear and grime, the fabric clinging to him like the last piece of dignity he refused to let go of. His fingers curled around each other, knuckles raw from the cold, and his gaze stayed fixed on the ground, as if looking anywhere else might break him. Stallone stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the pavement. The man barely acknowledged him, only flicking his eyes up for a second before turning away, already weary of whatever was coming next. "Look, I know how this goes," he muttered, voice rough, like gravel dragged across pavement. "You feel bad, toss a few bucks, and walk away feeling better about yourself." Stallone didn't move. He just stood there, arms relaxed at his sides, his expression unreadable. "That's what you think?" The man let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "That's what I know." He pulled his coat tighter, his shoulders stiff, as if he were bracing against more than just the cold. "Rich folks don't talk to us. They shouldn't. Just toss some change and move on. What's there to say?" A passing car splashed through a puddle, the headlights momentarily illuminating the deep lines in the man's face, the kind carved by time, struggle, and disappointment. Stallone crossed his arms, his stance firm but unthreatening. "Maybe I do," the man scoffed, shifting slightly against the wall. "Right. And what could you possibly have to say to me?" Stallone exhaled, his breath visible in the cool evening air. He met the man's eyes, unshaken, unwavering. "That's not just how it is." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Easy for you to say," he muttered. "You've got it all: money, fame, a life people only dream of." Stallone didn't argue. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the man as he vented. "You think it was always like that?" he asked, his voice calm, steady. The man shot him a sharp glance. "Oh, don't start," he said, voice thick with skepticism. "You gonna tell me you struggled? You ever slept on concrete, gone days without food, thought you'd die with nobody giving a damn?" Stallone didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He just listened. The man huffed, shaking his head again. "That's what I thought. Guys like you don't know what it's like. You were born lucky. People like me?" He gestured at himself with a bitter chuckle. "We lose. We stay lost." Stallone exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. He could have told the man his story, about the nights he slept in a bus station, about the days he went without food, about rejection after rejection. But this wasn't about proving himself. Instead, he just gave a small, knowing smile. "I don't have to tell you anything," he said quietly. "But I'm still here." The man narrowed his eyes, studying Stallone like he was trying to see past the face everyone else knew, the movie star, the millionaire, the legend. But something about the way Stallone stood there, not preaching, not pitying, just being, it was different. It wasn't the usual scripted sympathy or a quick handout to ease a rich man's conscience. Still, the bitterness didn't leave the man's voice. "So what, you're just here to listen?" he scoffed. "That it?" Stallone gave a slow nod. "If you got something to say..." The man let out a breath, looking away like he wanted to shut the door on the conversation. But no one ever asked, really asked. Most people either ignored him or tossed some change like he was a problem to be solved, not a person to be heard. A long silence stretched between them. The street noise hummed in the background, cars rolling by, muffled voices from the gym's entrance. Finally, the man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. His fingers lingered on the deep lines carved into his skin, like he could trace the years of hardship right there. "I was a Marine," he muttered. Stallone didn't react, didn't push, just waited. The man swallowed hard, voice quieter now. "I served my country. I had a life, a family." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Then it all went to hell. Loans piled up, lost my job, lost my home, and now here I am." He gave a hollow laugh, gesturing at the sidewalk beneath him. "Ain't much left to say, huh?" Stallone's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. He crouched down, bringing himself to the man's level, not above him, not looking down. "There's always more to say," he said simply. The man huffed, looking away, his fingers tightening into a fist on his lap. But something in Stallone's voice, low, steady, unshaken, made him pause. He stole a glance back at him, searching his face, and for the first time he hesitated. This wasn't pity. It wasn't some millionaire dropping a few wise words before disappearing into his perfect life. There was something else behind those eyes. Something raw. Something real. Stallone exhaled, his gaze steady. Before Rocky. Before the movies. Before any of it. I had nothing. His voice didn't waver, didn't dramatize. Just the truth. I was just another guy trying to make it in a world that didn't care if I lived or starved. He shook his head, the memories still sharp after all these years. I lived in a tiny, run-down apartment I could barely afford. I was rejected over and over again. Couldn't get a break, couldn't get a job. It got so bad. I had to sell my dog just to survive. His jaw tightened for a second before he forced himself to continue. And yeah, he added, his voice quieter now. There were nights I slept on the streets. Nights where I didn't eat, where I felt like the world had already decided I wasn't worth anything. The man's expression changed, just slightly. He wasn't convinced yet, but the doubt, the anger, it flickered. The walls he had built around himself, the ones that kept people out, weren't as solid as they'd been a moment ago. Stallone's voice remained steady, carrying a quiet strength that cut through the noise of the street. But I wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, not to press, but to make sure the words landed. No matter how bad it got, I kept fighting. I wasn't about to let the world tell me my story was over. He nodded toward the man, his eyes unwavering. And neither should you. The man let out a dry chuckle, but this time it lacked the bitterness from before. It was more hesitant, like he wasn't sure whether to dismiss Stallone or actually listen. You think I got a choice? His voice was quieter now, not as sharp. You think I can just... What? Pick myself up and make something out of nothing? He shook his head, rubbing a hand over his face. It doesn't work that way. Stallone didn't blink, didn't waver, and said, Doesn't it? The man exhaled sharply, dragging a rough, calloused hand down his face. His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. For the first time since their conversation began, he didn't have a sharp remark ready, no sarcastic retort to shut the moment down. He just sat there, silent. Because deep down, in a place he had tried to kill off years ago, a part of him wanted to believe. For so long he had convinced himself that this was it, that the streets were where he belonged now, that there was no way out, no second chances. He had swallowed that truth like bitter medicine, forcing himself to accept it because anything else, any shred of hope, was a cruel joke. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, someone wasn't looking past him. Stallone wasn't tossing him a few bucks and walking away, wasn't muttering some empty platitude before disappearing into a life he'd never understand. No, he was standing here looking at him like he was still something, like he was someone who mattered, and that terrified him. Because hope was dangerous. Hope made you think things could change. Hope made you believe you could fight. That maybe, just maybe, you weren't as lost as you thought. And he didn't know if he could handle that. Not again. Not after everything. Because if he let himself believe, if he let himself try, and the world knocked him back down one more time, he wasn't sure he'd ever get up again. Stallone let out a slow breath, then straightened, his presence towering yet steady. His voice was calm, unwavering. Listen, he said. I'm not here to tell you it's easy. I'm not going to stand here and feed you some fairy tale about how life just magically works out. His hand dipped into his pocket, pulling out a few folded bills. But he didn't just shove them forward. He held them for a beat, letting the weight of the moment settle. But I know one thing for sure. The man hesitated, then finally met Stallone's gaze. You've still got a fight left in you. The words hung between them, heavy, yet strangely gentle, cutting through the noise of the world rushing past. A long silence stretched between them. The city kept moving. Cars honked, people walked by, conversations filled the air. But here in this small, forgotten corner, something shifted. And for the first time in years, the man felt something other than emptiness. For the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure that he was beyond saving. Stallone reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and pressed them into the man's rough, calloused hand. His grip was firm, not just handing over money, but offering something more. A bridge. A moment of dignity. Get yourself a hot meal, all right? His voice was steady, not pitying, just matter-of-fact, like he was talking to an equal. The man stared at the money, fingers tightening around it. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, maybe a thank you, maybe an argument, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes burned, though he refused to let the tears fall. Stallone gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder, solid and grounding, then took a step back. No lecture, no demand, just a quiet, unspoken understanding. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the current of the city. The man watched him go, still clutching the bills, still feeling the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. For the first time in a long time, he didn't just feel seen. He felt human. The simple yet powerful gesture left the veteran in stunned silence, his fingers tightening around the bills as if afraid they might vanish. His chest ached, not from hunger this time, but from something deeper, something he thought he had buried long ago. He looked up, searching for Stallone, but the man was already blending into the city, his silhouette fading into the crowd. No lingering glance, no expectation of gratitude. Just a quiet exit, like a man who had done what he came to do and needed nothing in return. The veteran exhaled, the cool air stinging his lungs. He glanced down at the money once more, then, for the first time in years, lifted his head, not in defeat, but with the faintest spark of something he barely recognized. If this story moved you, the next one will stay with you long after it ends. Click the video on your screen to dive into another powerful tale, one that will make you think, smile, or maybe even change your perspective. Don't miss it. Your next story is just one click away.